There is a sound your body already knows. Not a melody, not a word. Something older, a vibration that lives in the space between your breath and your first conscious thought. You have felt it before in those rare moments of absolute stillness, when the noise of the world drops away and something inside you trembles, not with fear, but with recognition. That trembling is not a random biological event. It is the echo of a frequency that was once yours, completely, sovereignly yours, before something very deliberate reached into the architecture of human civilization and silenced it. This is not a metaphor. The ancient Gnostic texts, those buried in the Egyptian desert for over 1600 years, hidden beneath the sands of Nag Hammadi until their accidental discovery in 1945, speak of a technology of sound so precise, so structurally threatening to the invisible forces that govern this material plane, that its suppression was not merely a religious decision. It was an act of cosmic control. The scrolls describe the human voice, in its most intentional and tuned form, as a weapon. Not a weapon of violence, a weapon of dissolution, a frequency capable of cutting through the vibrational net that holds human consciousness in a state of perpetual low-energy sleep. What was erased was not just a prayer. What was erased was the key. To understand how deep this goes, you have to stop thinking of early Christianity as a spiritual movement that simply evolved over time. The transformation of Christian practice from the first century into the institutionalized religion of the Roman Empire was not organic. It was engineered. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD did not simply define theology. It drew a line around permissible experience. Everything inside that line was called faith. Everything outside it was called heresy. And what fell outside, crushed beneath the weight of official doctrine, was precisely the material that described the mechanics of consciousness, the nature of the invisible prison, and the specific tools that human beings could use to break free from it. Among those tools was the voice. Not the speaking voice of daily life, not the voice that orders food, argues, negotiates, performs. The sacred voice, the intentional voice, the voice activated with full awareness of its resonant architecture and directed with purpose into the field of energy that surrounds and interpenetrates the physical body. The Gnostic practitioners called this the Logos made flesh, not as a reference to Christ alone, but as a living principle. The idea that divine intelligence could be channeled through sound, through specific vibrational patterns produced by the human vocal apparatus, and that this channeling had measurable effects on the invisible structures of reality. The Church called this dangerous. The Church was right, but not for the reasons it claimed. Pay attention to your own daily experience for a moment. Think about what happens to you in the hours before and after you are exposed to prolonged noise, the relentless stream of notifications, arguments broadcast as entertainment, the low hum of collective anxiety that saturates digital space. Most people describe a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical effort, a heaviness, a depletion that sleep does not fully repair, a sense of being perpetually slightly less than you were. The dominant culture offers one explanation for this: stress. Modern life is stressful. Your cortisol is elevated. See a doctor. But the Gnostic cosmology offers a different explanation, one that the suppressed texts articulate with uncomfortable precision. The Archons. The word comes from ancient Greek, meaning rulers, governors, those who administer. In the Gnostic framework, the Archons are not supernatural monsters in any theatrical sense. They are intelligences, structural forces that operate at the level of frequency. Their function, as described in texts like the Apocryphon of John, is to maintain the density of the material world and to prevent the sparks of divine light, the monads, the true essence of each human being, from recognizing their own nature and ascending beyond the reach of the demiurge's domain. Their primary mechanism is not violence. It is vibrational suppression. They operate through frequencies of fear, of lack, of chronic low-level despair, and they are extraordinarily efficient at it, Because the entire infrastructure of modern existence has been, whether consciously or not, calibrated to broadcast exactly those frequencies, 24 hours a day. What silences an Archon? What disrupts the frequency net? The answer was known. It was practiced. It was encoded in specific vowel sequences that appear in Gnostic liturgical texts as what scholars have dismissively labeled voces, magical words, nonsense syllables, liturgical noise with no translatable meaning. Sequences like AEIOUO or IAOOUE. Arrangements of vowels that appear in the Pistis Sophia, in the Gospel of the Egyptians, in fragments of the books of Jew texts that the emerging Orthodox Church moved systematically to destroy, discredit, or bury in categories of irrelevance. Scholars who encountered them in the 19th and early 20th centuries largely dismissed them as corrupted text, scribal error, or primitive magic with no coherent theological content. They were none of those things. They were instructions, precise, functional, reproducible instructions for a practice of vocal resonance that the Gnostic initiates understood to operate directly on the vibrational field, what contemporary science hesitantly approaches through the language of bioelectromagnetics, of cymatics, of the measurable effects of sound frequency on cellular and neurological structure. The ancient practitioners did not have that vocabulary, but they had the experience. They knew what happened in the body and in the energetic field when those sequences were vocalized correctly, with breath, with intention, with the specific placement of resonance in the chest cavity, the skull, the soft tissue of the throat. They knew because they could feel the architecture of the invisible world respond. And here is the detail that the history books will never tell you, the detail that makes the suppression make complete sense. Those vowel sequences were not merely devotional. They were not expressions of praise directed at a deity outside the self. They were activations. Activations of the monad, the divine spark within that temporarily but powerfully disrupted the archonic frequency field surrounding the practitioner. In the language of the Gnostic texts, they caused the Archons to retreat from the light, a description that, stripped of its mythological framing, means something remarkably concrete. The frequency of fear cannot coexist with a specific counter-frequency produced by the living human voice operating at full conscious power. This is why the silence was imposed. Not because the practice was superstition, because it worked. The institution that inherited the wreckage of Gnostic Christianity did not eliminate these teachings because they were false. It eliminated them because they were transferable. A faith that requires a priest, a building, an intermediary, a hierarchy. That faith generates dependency, and dependency generates control. But a practice that lives in your own throat, that requires nothing but your breath and your intention, that connects you directly to the vibrational layer of reality without any external authority to validate or deny the experience. That practice dismantles control at the root. You were not born into silence, you were trained into it. And what was used to perform that training, the mechanisms behind the suppression, the specific tools the system deployed to make sure you would never think to raise your own voice as an act of spiritual sovereignty. That is where this descent into the hidden architecture truly begins, because the method of silencing was not simple, it was layered. And one of those layers carries a name that the Orthodox tradition has spent 17 centuries making sure you would associate with obedience rather than liberation. What that layer contains will restructure everything you think you know about where your energy goes and why it never fully comes back. There is a moment in the Gospel of the Egyptians, one of the texts recovered from Nag Hammadi, one of the texts that the institutional church never wanted you to read, where the divine voice speaks not in sentences but in pure sound. The original Coptic manuscript renders it as a sequence of vowels repeated in specific patterns, ascending and descending in a structure that resembles nothing so much as a musical score. The translators who first encountered this passage in the modern era flagged it as liturgical gibberish. a textual anomaly, something lost in the process of copying and recopying through generations of scribes who did not understand what they were preserving. But the Gnostic initiates who composed that text understood exactly what they were encoding. They were not writing poetry, they were writing a map. To grasp why these vowel sequences function the way they do, why they are not arbitrary, not decorative, not the superstition of a pre-scientific people clutching at invisible things, you have to understand something about the relationship between sound, structure, and the field of consciousness that your body is constantly generating and broadcasting. The ancient world did not separate these categories. The Greek concept of the logos, which appears at the opening of the Gospel of John in the phrase rendered in English, as in the beginning was the Word, was not a theological abstraction for the Gnostics. It was a physical principle. The logos was the vibrational intelligence that preceded matter, that organized matter, and that continued to operate as the deepest layer of reality beneath everything the physical senses could detect. The Word was not something spoken about God. The Word was the mechanism by which consciousness shaped the world. And the human voice, when used with full awareness of its resonant properties, was the closest thing available to a direct interface with that mechanism. Now consider what happens to a vowel when it is produced by the human body. Unlike consonants, which are formed by obstruction, by the teeth, the lips, the tongue interrupting the flow of breath, vowels are open. They are unobstructed columns of vibrating air shaped by the cavity of the mouth and the position of the vocal cords. They are the voice in its most elemental form. In the ancient Mediterranean world, across Egyptian, Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew traditions, the vowel sounds held a category of significance that the consonants did not. In classical Hebrew, the name of the divine was written without vowels, not because the vowels were unimportant, but because they were too important to commit to writing. The vowels were the living breath of the word. They were what made it real. The Gnostic practitioners who developed the sequences found in the Pistis Sophia and the books of Jude were working from this same foundational understanding, but they pushed it into territory that the emerging Orthodox tradition found intolerable. They claimed and demonstrated through practice that specific arrangements of vowel sounds, produced with specific patterns of breath and resonance directed into specific regions of the body, created a coherent vibrational signal powerful enough to interact with what they called the seven heavens of the Archons. The seven heavens were not paradise, they were prison architecture. In the Gnostic cosmological map, the material world is surrounded by a series of vibrational layers called heavens, or sometimes eons, each governed by an archonic intelligence. These layers are not physical in the conventional sense. They are frequency bands, and their function in the Gnostic description is to intercept the rising consciousness of the monad, the divine spark within each human being, and redirect it back into the cycle of material existence. The soul attempting to ascend toward the pleroma, the fullness of divine light, must pass through each of these layers. And at each layer, the governing archon demands a toll, an energetic surrender, a vibrational password, a proof of frequency high enough to pass. The sacred vowel sequences were those passwords. This is not allegory. The Gnostic texts treat it with the precision of technical instruction. In the books of Jude, the risen Christ does not deliver theological sermons. He delivers sequences, specific arrangements of vowel sounds associated with specific archonic layers, explained in terms of their vibrational properties and the energetic effects they produce when activated by a practitioner who understands their function. The text is structured like a manual. It anticipates the question, "What do I do?" and it answers with extraordinary specificity. The Orthodox Church, in the process of constructing the biblical canon, excluded these texts entirely. The justification offered was theological. These were heretical documents promoting false doctrine. But look at what specifically they contained, and the justification reveals itself as something more strategic. The books of Ju gave individuals direct access to a practice that required no intermediary, no priest, no sacrament, no institutional structure of any kind. The practitioner and the frequency, nothing else. In a religious architecture built entirely on the necessity of hierarchy, on the indispensable role of ordained authority standing between the human being and the divine, a text that said your own voice is sufficient was not merely theologically incorrect. It was structurally catastrophic. Now bring this into the texture of your daily experience. You live inside a frequency environment that has been, again, whether by design or by the accumulated momentum of a system that benefits from your depletion, calibrated to keep your vibrational state in the lower registers. The frequencies of chronic anxiety, of low-grade helplessness, of the particular exhaustion that comes not from doing too much but from feeling that nothing you do produces real change. These are not just emotional states. They are measurable vibrational conditions. And they are precisely the conditions that the Gnostic texts associate with archonic influence, with the activation of the frequency net designed to keep the monad from recognizing its own power. What you call depression, the ancient practitioners called the weight of the demiurge. What you call burnout, they called the drain of the lower eons. The language is different. The phenomenon being described is identical. And here is where the suppressed knowledge becomes not just historically interesting, but immediately, practically urgent. The vowel sequence that appears most consistently across the Gnostic liturgical texts, the one that recurs in the Pistis Sophia, in the Gospel of the Egyptians, in the fragmentary Coptic texts associated with the tradition of Valentinus, is a sequence that moves through the full spectrum of vowel resonance in a specific ascending order. In the transliteration used by scholars, it appears most often as a variation of the pattern A-E Emacron, I-O-U Omacron. 7 vowels. 7 archonic layers. The correspondence is explicit in the texts themselves. Each vowel resonates primarily in a different region of the body: the lower abdomen, the solar plexus, the chest, the throat, the nasal cavity, the upper skull, the crown. Each region corresponds to what later esoteric traditions would call an energy center, a chakra, a vibrational node in the subtle body. The Gnostics did not use that vocabulary, but they mapped the same territory. When this sequence is produced vocally, not mentally, not silently, but physically, with breath and intention and full resonant commitment, it creates what the texts describe as a column of light moving through the body from the lowest point of the material self to the highest point of the monadic essence. In the archonic framework, this column disrupts the frequency signature that the lower eons use to identify and drain the practitioner. It is, in the most literal interpretation the texts support, a cancellation signal, a counterfrequency, the vibrational equivalent of a key turning in a lock that the Archons did not want you to know existed. There is a reason that the monastic traditions that survived within Orthodox Christianity, the Hesychast tradition of Eastern Christianity, certain currents of contemplative practice within Western monasticism, preserved fragmentary versions of breath and sound practices that bear unmistakable structural resemblance to the Gnostic vowel work. These traditions survived precisely because they were embedded within institutional frameworks that gave them protective camouflage. The practice was kept alive, but its Gnostic context, its explicit framing as a tool for disrupting archonic influence, was stripped away. What remained was the shell of the practice without the key that explained what the practice was actually doing. A technique without its cosmological map is a door with no knowledge of what it opens. The knowledge of what it opens was never destroyed. It was displaced, scattered into fragments across texts that the Academy classified as marginal, mystical, or incomprehensible, preserved in traditions that encoded it in symbolic language dense enough to deter casual interpretation, hidden in the structure of practices whose surface appearance gave no indication of the vibrational warfare being conducted beneath. And one of those hiding places, perhaps the most unexpected, perhaps the most perfectly concealed, exists inside a text that billions of people have encountered, repeated, and passed over without recognizing the weapon embedded in its syllables. A text that was preserved not despite its power but, in a historical irony of staggering proportions, because the institution that feared that power was forced to incorporate it into the canonical structure before the full extent of what it contained was understood. What that text contains, and what happens to the archonic field when its true vibrational sequence is activated rather than merely recited, is the threshold that changes everything. Because the practice is not theoretical, it is not historical, it is available to anyone willing to use their voice as something other than an instrument of social compliance. But activating it incorrectly does not simply fail to work. According to the Gnostic texts, an activation without proper energetic grounding does something considerably more consequential than nothing. What it attracts instead is the question that the final movement of this revelation was designed to answer. Expand Part 3, the energetic climax plus the liberation reflection. There is a warning buried in the Pistis Sophia that almost no one who has read it has paused long enough to take seriously. It appears in the midst of what looks like cosmological description, a passage about the nature of the Archons and the mechanics of their influence over the material world and its states, with a directness unusual for a text otherwise given to layered symbolic language, that the sacred sound activated without the protection of gnosis does not pass through the archonic layers unnoticed. It passes through them announced. The frequency rises, and the Archons do not retreat from it. They turn toward it. They are drawn to it the way a predator is drawn to movement in low visibility, not because the sound is weak, but because its incompleteness signals an opening rather than a closure. A monad attempting to vibrate at the frequency of liberation, without first understanding the architecture of what it is moving through, is not invisible to the lower eons. It is luminous, and luminosity without armor in archonic territory is not transcendence. It is an invitation. This is the knowledge that was never meant to reach you, not the existence of the practice. Fragments of that have surfaced repeatedly throughout history, in mystical traditions, in esoteric schools, in the underground currents of contemplative religion that survived institutionalization by hiding in plain sight. What was most carefully suppressed was not the technique itself, but the preparatory understanding, the gnosis, that makes the technique a shield rather than a beacon. Because a practice that attracts without protecting is not a liberation tool. It is a more efficient form of the same drain it was supposed to disrupt. Think about the landscape of modern spiritual seeking for a moment. The explosion of breathwork practices, sound healing sessions, frequency meditations, vibrational activation videos. The entire architecture of contemporary spiritual technology points toward something real, something that millions of people are feeling their way toward through intuition and partial information. The hunger is genuine. The direction is largely correct. But the missing piece, the Gnostic preparatory framework that the suppressed texts understood as non-negotiable, is almost universally absent from the modern presentation. And its absence produces exactly what the archonic system benefits from most: spiritual practitioners who open their energetic field without knowing how to close it, who raise their frequency without knowing how to seal the boundaries of the monad against what that raised frequency attracts. The ancient initiates called the preparatory work the building of the luminous garment. The Pistis Sophia describes it in specific terms: a wrapping of the monad in a particular quality of awareness before any vocalization begins. This awareness is not an emotion, and it is not a belief. It is a recognition. A visceral, embodied recognition of the distinction between the monad, the uncreated divine spark that is the actual self, and the entirety of the material and archonic structure that surrounds it. The recognition that the body is in the world but the monad is not of it. That the frequencies of fear, of lack, of chronic low-grade despair that saturate the material environment are not native to the monad. They are transmissions. They are external signals that the nervous system has been conditioned to receive and amplify, as if they were its own voice. The moment of true recognition, not as intellectual concept but as lived, embodied certainty, is the moment the luminous garment begins to form, and it is only from within that garment that the sacred vowel sequence functions as the Gnostic texts describe it, as a cancellation signal rather than a summoning. Here is what actually happens when the sequence is activated correctly. The sound begins in the lowest register of the body, not the lowest note the voice can produce, but the lowest region of physical resonance, the base of the torso, the floor of the body. The first vowel of the sequence is not performed. It is released. There is a distinction that every Gnostic practitioner who left written records of the experience describes in similar language, the difference between producing a sound and allowing a sound to move through you. The former keeps the practitioner in the position of a performer separate from the frequency, directing it from outside. The latter dissolves that separation. The body becomes a resonant cavity. The monad becomes the source, and the quality of the vibration produced by that dissolution is categorically different from anything the performing voice can generate, because it carries within it the frequency signature of the uncreated, the pleroma's echo inside the material form. As the vowel sequence ascends through the body, each sound moving the center of resonance progressively upward through the regions the Gnostics associated with successive archonic layers, something occurs in the energetic field surrounding the practitioner that the texts describe with a consistency remarkable across documents written in different periods and different cultural contexts. The field contracts before it expands. There is a moment brief, but unmistakable to anyone who has genuinely entered the practice of intense pressure. A gathering, a sense of the invisible architecture of the material world pressing in with sudden awareness of what is happening within it. This is the Archons registering the counter-frequency. What happens next is the moment the system of control never prepared a language for, because the pressure does not become an attack, it becomes a threshold. The complete vowel sequence, all 7 resonances moving in unbroken continuity from the base to the crown, each vowel given full duration and full physical resonance, produces a coherent signal that the archonic frequency net cannot absorb or redirect. It can only move away from it. The texts say the Archons retreat from the light. What this means experientially is a sudden and profound sense of clearing, not euphoria, not mystical overwhelm, something quieter and more fundamental than either of those things, a silence that is not empty but full. The silence of a frequency environment from which the transmissions of fear and lack have been, at least temporarily, removed. In that silence, the monad remembers what it is. This is what the suppression was designed to prevent, not your belief in anything, not your participation in any particular religious structure. The system of control that the Gnostic texts describe, the demiurge and its archonic infrastructure, does not require your theological agreement. It requires only your vibrational compliance. It requires that the frequency of your daily inner life remain within the range of the lower eons. Anxious enough, depleted enough, distracted enough. The specific content of the distraction is irrelevant. Whether you are consumed by political outrage or spiritual seeking, by material ambition or existential despair, as long as the frequency remains in the lower registers, the drain continues. The monad continues to leak its light into the archonic field, and the system continues to function exactly as it was constructed to function. What breaks the system is not a belief. It is not a conversion. It is not even an understanding in the intellectual sense. It is a frequency, a specific, embodied, physically produced counterfrequency that the monad generates when it remembers, even briefly, even imperfectly, what it actually is and where it actually comes from. You are not created for compliance. You are not seeded into this material plane to spend the duration of your physical existence leaking light into the lower eons, while the voice that could recall you to your own sovereignty sits silent in your throat, trained into decorative irrelevance by a system that understood exactly how dangerous it was. The Gnostic practitioners who preserved these sequences did so under conditions that are almost impossible to fully comprehend from a position of contemporary comfort. They preserved them knowing that the institution moving to erase them had the full weight of imperial authority behind it. They preserved them in texts designed to be misread by casual observers, in layers of symbolic language that functioned as encryption, in fragmentary forms that required genuine initiation to reconstruct. They did not preserve them as historical artifacts. They preserved them as living technology, as tools intended to remain functional across whatever span of time the suppression required before the conditions for their reemergence were met. Those conditions are not a mystery, they were described. The texts speak of a time when the density of the material world would reach a particular intensity, when the archonic frequency field would be at its most pervasive and most overt, when the mechanisms of energetic drain would be so thoroughly embedded in the fabric of daily life that their presence would become invisible through sheer ubiquity. A time when the noise would be so constant that silence itself would feel like an aberration. A time when the human being's relationship to their own voice would have been so thoroughly reduced to the social and the performative that the idea of using sound as a tool of spiritual sovereignty would seem, to most people, either primitive or absurd. Look at the world you are living in. Decide for yourself whether those conditions have been met. Because what the Gnostic tradition offers stripped of its ancient cultural architecture, carried forward into this specific moment in this specific historical configuration, is not a religion. It is not a belief system requiring subscription. It is a practice, a technology of consciousness that operates through the human body using nothing more sophisticated than breath, awareness, and the willingness to allow the voice to function as something other than a social instrument. It asks only that you treat your own monad as real, that you accept, at least provisionally and experimentally, that the divine spark within you is not a metaphor, that it is a frequency, that frequencies interact, and that the interaction between your monadic frequency and the archonic field is not fixed. It is changeable. It is, in the most literal sense available, something you can do something about. Every time the sequence is activated, every time a human being allows the full resonance of the sacred vowels to move through a body that has been prepared with the recognition of its own monadic nature, something registers in the vibrational structure of the world that the material system cannot account for and cannot neutralize. It is a small thing in the scale of cosmic time, a single candle against an architecture of darkness engineered across millennia. But the Gnostic texts are consistent on this point. The pleroma does not measure light by volume. The uncreated does not calculate in quantities. The monad that remembers itself, even once, even briefly, even imperfectly, has already done something that the entire infrastructure of the lower eons was constructed to prevent. It has remembered that it is free. Not free in the way the material world uses that word, not free from obligation or consequence or the ordinary gravity of physical existence. Free in the way the pleroma uses it. Free in the sense that the monad's essential nature, its original frequency, its divine signature, was never actually altered by the density of the material world, no matter how convincingly the archonic field made that alteration seem total and permanent. The prison was real. The walls were real. The drain was real, but the monad inside it, the light inside the architecture of suppression, was always real too, always present, always resonant, always waiting for the moment when the voice that carries it decided to stop being an instrument of the system and start being what it was from the very beginning designed to be. The weapon that the demiurge could never confiscate, because it was never external to you, because it has always lived, unsilenced and indestructible, in the one place no Archon has ever had the authority to enter. Your own breath, your own resonance, your own voice finally freed. The silence imposed on you was never spiritual, it was structural, and now you know what breaks it. If this knowledge moves something in you, if you feel, beneath the language and the history, the specific recognition of someone who has always sensed that the world was arranged to keep you from something essential, then what you are feeling is the monad responding to its own frequency. Leave your like as a seal on that recognition. Tell me in the comments, where in your body did you feel the resonance first? Because the answer to that question is not random. And what it reveals about the archonic layer that has been working hardest against your specific monad is the thread this descent into hidden knowledge follows next, into territory that even the Gnostic initiates marked as the most carefully guarded secret of the entire system.